Fitzhugh Brundage, professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In the 75 years after the Civil War, violence was pervasive in the American South. The region was perceived to be violent by Southerners, and they wrung their hands over the violence, trying to explain it and what to do with it, what to do about it. It was perceived to be a violent region by people outside the South. And some of the violence was perceived to be very peculiar to certain regions of the South. So the Mountain South got a reputation for feuding because of the Hatfields and McCoys, who were, what happened between the Hatfields and McCoys was turned into something seemingly symptomatic of an exotic culture in the Mountain South. But there are other forms of violence that were indistinguishable, whether they happened in the Mountain South or in the Low Country South or wherever it happened in the South. And lynching was one example of violence that was alarmingly commonplace in the American South, and that happened from the backwoods of the Mountain South to the Low Country of South Carolina. Most often we think of lynch mobs as being frontiersmen taking a cattle rustler or some gunman out, hanging them from a tree. And these are bad people being punished in a region where there wasn't enough law. And that, of course, did not apply in the American South. It didn't apply during Reconstruction, but it certainly didn't apply by the early 20th century, when there were still routine instances of lynching in the American South. So it wasn't the absence of law. In fact, in virtually everywhere, every county where lynchings happened in the South, the court system was functioning properly. And in about 2/3 of the cases of lynchings in the American South, the mob's victim or victims were actually taken from law officers. So it's not that these were people, criminals that couldn't be caught or punished. These were alleged criminals in the hands of the law who were taken out and killed. And in some instances, they were literally taken out of courtrooms where they were being prosecuted. So the law was prevented from acting. And I mention this because it speaks to the level of complicity at all levels of Southern society. Southern white society that made lynching possible. There was, of course, the complicity sometimes of legal authorities who actively contributed to the environment. By that I mean the kind of emotional environment that could generate a lynch mob, but also complicity in turning prisoners over easily, or the complicity in creating, shall we say, of actively suggesting that if an alleged criminal was taken to trial, that there was no way around a poor white woman having to testify in court and expose herself to the ridicule of the community, which of course was a gross exaggeration of what would have happened in any trial. So the point of this is that lynchings happened with broad popular participation and support in many instances. And even in those instances when there wasn't broad popular support or participation, there was virtually never any steps taken to punish anyone who engaged in it. So a community might wring its hands over the fact that a lynching had occurred, but it was a sort of tut-tutting of saying, well, we shouldn't have let that happen, but now that it's over, let's just never let it happen again. There was no consequences, in other words, for anyone who participated in a mob as a result of executing someone. We may be tempted to imagine that lynchings are some kind of traditional culture asserting itself. It's like a holdover from some more violent past. But the lynching that really peaked in the South between, we'll say, 1890 and 1920. And as you say, during the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century in particular, it didn't happen in the backwaters, the deep backwaters of the South, or anywhere else in the nation. It tended to happen in communities that had railroads. It tended to happen in communities that were often the legal, I should say, governmental centers of the local area, the county seats, for example, in really rural areas. But there were lynchings that happened in many, many, many major southern cities. So these are the environments where the new South is being born and created. So it's not, as you suggest, it's partially tied to communication, partially tied to transportation. And I think there are several reasons why. So it's not one single simple reason. But let's first talk about these New South cities. A city like Birmingham, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, Knoxville, these may have been cities that had an antebellum history. They may have existed before then, although Birmingham and Atlanta barely did. But they may have existed. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, they were, by their standards, booming. And so many questions of racial etiquette, of urban behavior, had to be worked out in these communities. And this was happening in other American cities where the issue was not so much race, but ethnicity. So in a city like Chicago, it's working out how ethnic communities are going to coexist in a kind of pluralistic city. Well, in the South, it's the issue of, okay, how are jobs going to be divided up along the race line? How are residential boundaries going to be established? How's the etiquette of urban street life going to be controlled? So those are all questions that would, of course, come to be pressing in communities that were growing, changing, transforming, bringing together populations that did not have long established traditions of being together. So that's part of it. Then you add in communication, and I think that's very important because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the wire services were weaving together the South and the rest of the nation in a way, so that really between 1890 and 1920, a national news market, as we might think of it, emerges. We think of a sort of 24/7 news market of today. Well, imagine a world when the telegraph made it possible for a wire service story from what would be perceived a small southern town in the hinterlands could be transferred, picked up by a wire service, and then could be on the front page of every newspaper. And what newspaper isn't going to print stories about lynchings? I mean, this was an era when murders, suicides, lynchings, that's good newspaper news. So newspapers, in a sense, became the forum in which lynching was presented to the public, far removed from the site of the lynching, and was interpreted. It was in the editorial pages of newspapers that people debated whether lynching was good or not. Why were black men raping white women would be a topic in newspapers. So it became possible for the news of lynching to be circulated in a way that it could never have been, and it never was prior to the turn of the 20th century. And then I think transportation's crucial because the prime victims of mob violence were, broadly speaking, what we would call young, comparatively footloose black men. And a young black man who isn't tied down, you don't know him, you don't know his background, you don't know his people, you don't know to what white people he is, so to speak, subservient. That's the white person's worst nightmare. The black man who doesn't seem beholden to anybody, who can float, as they were called, who could be a vagrant. All of those traits. And of course, railroads made that type of black man possible. And so it's not surprising that black miners They were migrating from place to place. Black railroad workers, black lumbermen, black turpentine men. These are all jobs that were typically carried out by young, vigorous black men when they still had the strength to do these very taxing jobs. And of course, whites were deeply suspicious of exactly that type of black man. So I think transportation, communications are both very important to this story, this tragedy. As the demography of some of the areas of the South that were being incorporated into either commercial crop agriculture or into mining, some sort of extractive industry shifted. There were instances of white communities essentially drawing a line and saying, we don't want this to happen here. Because if these economic innovations are brought into our community, it means we're going to have black people. And we'd rather forego that type of economic development if it means African Americans would come in. So along the northern border of the Cotton Belt in Georgia, for example, there are instances of whites saying, well, if cotton means we're going to have sharecropping and we're going to have black sharecroppers, we don't want them. It's okay if you have white sharecroppers, but we're not going to be displaced from the land so that white planters can bring in black sharecroppers. Or it can be an instance where a community draws the line and says, we don't want black railroad workers and miners coming into this area. And if you bring them in, we're going to resort to violence and make it impossible for you, that is to the employers, to carry out your business. And so we can think of it as a kind of ethnic cleansing, which it was, a racial cleansing in the eyes of whites. But that would be an instance when in those communities, I think the whites who engaged in that would have said they were preserving their economic opportunities. And they believed that there was a choice between either economic opportunities being diverted to blacks by other whites, more often than not. So by these outside economic forces imposing blacks in a place that either whites wanted for themselves or they didn't want that type of economic development. And so there were communities where whites successfully did this, but just as often, or I'd say more often, there are communities where whites may have wanted to do that, but the economic power of a mining company, a lumbering company, turpentiners, or big planters overwhelmed them. So the expulsions almost certainly in those places where they happen in the South speak to an opposition to change that was probably much more widespread than we recognize, because only some of these expulsions were successful. Whenever racial violence happened in the South, local communities in the aftermath tended to be quite defensive about their reputation. And it's just entirely predictable. And so local communities would offer a rationale for the violence that had marred their community. And the rationale would be that we're deeply law-abiding people, but this crime was so awful, so horrific, that we broke free from the conventional restraints that we abide by normally. Or they'd make the argument, well, we didn't do this. It's people from outside the community who came in and did this. We're law-abiding. These were outsiders. We don't know who they are, so we can't prosecute them. So it's not really a stain on our community. Or else they would respond by justifying their behavior by saying, well, yes, we had a lynching, but so did you, or so did this community. Or if a Chicago newspaper is denouncing my community for our violence, how about all the gangsters who are running amok in Chicago? So no one else should throw a stone at us because your community's got its problems. Well, I think in the case of the Mountain South, this violence played into a long established perception that they were being singled out somehow, that somehow the Mountain South was this exotic, violent place, and that it revealed that as these instances of racial violence or whatever else negative that would be raised up about the region was somehow a marker of the primitiveness, the backwardness of the region. And so I do think there is the commonplace lore that somehow mountain people are less tolerant, that mountain people are more bigoted, more isolated and withdrawn and suspicious, has contributed simultaneously to the idea that somehow the Mountain South was freer, a response to that, if you will, a rejection of that with the notion that somehow the Mountain South is freer of some of the most unpleasant, most violent manifestations of the pathology of white racism. And so I do think there are ways, it's not so much that the actual practice of the violence itself differed necessarily from region to region, but the meanings assigned to it. So that you end up with a cultural phenomenon, I think expressed perhaps in its purest form in a book and a film like Deliverance, where the Mountain South is where really primal violence happens. And I don't think that's an accurate representation of the violence that happened in the Mountain South, let alone elsewhere in the South. You asked before about what's happening in the first 2 decades of the 20th century to make it such a fertile moment for racial violence, mob violence of all kinds. And I do think that's a moment in time. In the late 19th century, there were a lot of things happening in the American South that bred a wide variety of violence. From agrarian distress to labor violence to racial violence, just a wide variety of violence. But the violence of the early 20th century seems to become, it's not that there is necessarily less violence, but it becomes more routinized, more almost predictable. And I think part of that is the way in which the justification for lynching becomes codified almost. And it becomes not just codified, but it then becomes elevated to the point where it's incorporated into American popular music, into American popular film, like Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's epic movie, which is really a call for white supremacy in the Reconstruction era, but obviously was intended to promote white racial solidarity in the 20th century as well. Well, what was being elevated was the idea that African American men were primitive, brutal, violent, and prone to transgress against whites, but especially white women. So that notion of the black rapist got elevated in the early 20th century. In a way, it was circulating in the late 19th century, but it gets refined. And it gets incorporated into, as I said, virtually all American popular culture. And we can only imagine the effect of incorporating that image into a movie that was so unprecedented in its cultural impact. There's no way we can come up with a contemporary analogy. The only one that I could vaguely imagine is sort of imagine if Star Wars had actually been a movie dedicated to the politics of white supremacy. And then we might see something of its impact. But absolutely, Birth of a Nation provided an incredibly visceral film rendition of the Black Threat. And that's 4 years before Knoxville, 4 years before the Red Summer. And people were still watching it. Of course, they continued, as you probably know, they continued to show Birth of a Nation in the South on through the 1930s. Even after sound movies came in, you could still show Birth of a Nation in the South and draw a crowd. So it circulated long after its initial debut.